Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from Daniel chapter 5. The whole chapter is about this situation with Belshazzar, a king named Belshazzar, and Daniel. Belshazzar is a couple of kings past Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, he is not, there is no relation, physical by blood relation to Nebuchadnezzar. But certainly Belshazzar should have kind of been aware of the past experiences of the kings. We see starting in verse 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. This term father here, it means predecessor. And that's why some people attempt to bring up, oh, well, the Bible's not accurate, and lists of quote-unquote inaccuracies of the Bible. Daniel 5:2 is sometimes mentioned. In fact, Daniel's going to mention your father or grandfather here in a little while. But this term means your predecessor, the one who came before you. And so it's not that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, or that there was any necessarily physical relation to Nebuchadnezzar, but that that Nebuchadnezzar was a predecessor. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was an extremely popular and well-known king. And so certainly all of the kings following Nebuchadnezzar, at least up to where the Medes and the Persians take over, the Babylonians certainly looked up to Nebuchadnezzar. And so all of them should have been aware and known kind of the history of Nebuchadnezzar. So, but we remember Nebuchadnezzar going back all the way to Daniel chapter 1, and how that Nebuchadnezzar, he came, I think it was 3 separate times to Jerusalem to seize it. And on multiple times, he kind of takes the spoils of Jerusalem, including the temple. And this is what's being referred to here in verse 2. So they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. The king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them, and they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So you'll note what's taking place here. They're taking the sanctified vessels of Jehovah that had been sanctified and set apart for the service in the tabernacle, in the temple. And they use them not only to have a party, but also to exalt the false gods, the false idols that they serve, the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Verse 5, in the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. A lot of times in visual depictions, pictures, things like that people kind of devise, they show the entire hand, and it could be that's what appeared. But note what is recorded for us. It's verse 5: the fingers of a man's hand appeared. Whether it was all 5 or just the one, or that's writing. But it's the fingers of a man's hand, not necessarily an entire hand. But I just kind of thought that's interesting that here appears a finger. It starts writing on the wall, and the king sees it. Verse 6, the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, his knees knocked against each other. There's a physical reaction that takes place when something happens that absolutely terrifies you. You grow faint, and you kind of just lose all cohesion, so to speak. So the physical strength in your body, it's like you just kind of you just kind of fall over. True terror, true fear can elicit this type of response. And in verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck. He shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, what's being written is part of the problem. It's not just the fact that something's written, they can understand the words, they just don't know what they necessarily represent or mean. It's the actual reading of this writing that they can't actually read it. It's not in a language that they recognize. Then also tell me its interpretation. So that's part of the problem. All the king's men came. They could not read the writing, nor make known to the king its interpretation. And so Belshazzar is greatly troubled. His countenance is changed. His lords were astonished. So then the queen, she remembers a man named Daniel. He has of the ability to tell of understanding and wisdom and visions and things like that. He mentions the fact that Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the musicians and the soothsayers. Again, this term father is predecessor, not literal physical father. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Very similar to Belshazzar, but not the same. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So Daniel's brought before the king, and the king asks, are you the Daniel who was brought of the captives of Judah? Now keep in mind, at this point, Daniel is, I wouldn't say he's elderly. By the time King Darius throws him into the lion's den, he's elderly. But he's up in age. Okay, you figure probably in his 50s, maybe-ish, general estimate here. I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. The wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. And then so he promises him a great reward if he will be able to tell him what this means. Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. Again, even Daniel uses this term, Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor. It's always going back to Nebuchadnezzar. Mainly because if we read the first 4 chapters and some of the things that happened with Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar came to glorify Jehovah. I wouldn't say that he worshiped Jehovah exclusively, or that he was converted in any way to being a Jew, but Nebuchadnezzar, he even issued a decree earlier in the book of Daniel, acknowledging the power of the God of Israel. And there's all kinds of associations with that. And King Darius later on will also issue a decree recognizing the King of Jehovah, having saved Daniel from the lion's mouth and so forth. Darius will acknowledge the power of Jehovah. Belshazzar, however, will not be as wise. We see that King Nebuchadnezzar was given this kingdom, this majesty, and because of the majesty he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts. His dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdoms of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, this term means, well, there's predecessor, so this is the opposite of predecessor, the postecessor, however you want to say that, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Regardless of the kings that had come before, Nebuchadnezzar, he stood out among them all. He was synonymous with Babylon. And Belshazzar certainly knew the story of Nebuchadnezzar. He knew his history. In fact, it's very likely when Belshazzar became king, he was kind of given the rundown of, at the very least, the last 4 or 5 of his predecessors, kind of their history. Verse 23, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You praise the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Now, this, I guess you could say, if there was a thesis verse or a thesis statement of chapter 5, this is it right here. You've praised these false gods which do not see or hear or know, and the God, Jehovah, who holds your breath in his hand. He's the one who has the power. He's the one who controls all things. You have not glorified. So the fingers of the hand were sent from him. And notice even Daniel mentions the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Now, we're not told exactly what language this is written in. It could have been Hebrew, and although you would think that the wise men of the Babylons, of the Chaldeans, that they would understand and be able to interpret Hebrew. But whatever this language was, whatever the writing, the whether it was cuneiform or whatever, Daniel's able to read the inscription. He says it's Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And so this is what these terms are. And what do they mean? Well, this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Twice, God says that. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, or Upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So this is what the phrase Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, this is what it means. So Belshazzar, he rewards Daniel. Obviously, Belshazzar doesn't. I mean, you would think he would make some kind of plea to Jehovah or plea to Daniel to plead to Jehovah for him. That night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being 62 years old. And Darius is the one we're familiar with, throwing Daniel in the lion's den. But one of the things that is interesting, of course, this entire account is really interesting. And obviously, the component of not glorifying Jehovah, recognizing he's the one who holds the breath of life in his hands. He's the one who has all control. But we have two phrases that we sometimes hear and use in our society. His days have been numbered is one phrase, or their days are numbered, or your days are numbered. And then the other one is you have been weighed, you have been measured, you have been found wanting. This is the origin of both of those phrases. And it's obvious. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Okay, your days are numbered and your kingdom's days are numbered, but certainly obviously we know that Belshazzar's days were numbered as well. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you've been found wanting. And then there's the specific of your kingdom has been divided and it's going to be given. So the Babylonian kingdom is going to be split up between the Medes and the Persians. Now, obviously, this, like I said, this entire account has numerous applications for us. But one thing that I want us to think about is if God were to send to us the fingers of a hand and were to write on the wall next to us, and it said something like this, what would the interpretation of that be? What would the end result be? Because this isn't necessarily the way in which this is used. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Okay, so God has set a limit to, let's say, your life. Okay, God has ordained that you will not see the morning. Okay, let's put it that way. Maybe it's not necessarily a condemnation, but it's certainly an ending. You have been weighed in the balances. Let's just leave it there. Leave it at the you've been weighed in the balances. Okay. And regarding the physical kingdom, okay, let's leave that out. Let's just do Mene and Tekel. God sends us a message saying your life will end tonight, or you won't see the morning. You have been weighed in the balances. You've been measured. Would God include you have been found wanting? Or would he say you've been found approved? And more to the point, more to the application, when we get to Judgment Day, when we stand before Jesus at judgment, will Jesus say, "You have been weighed in the balances. I've measured your life, your character, your attitude against the ultimate standard, which is Jesus himself and the gospel that he gave us, his word." Jesus himself says, "It's my words will judge us in the last day." You've been weighed, you've been measured by that standard. Will we have been found wanting? Or will we have been found approved? Balanced in such a way that we did what God told us to do, even if that means maybe there were times we weren't perfect. Obviously, no one is perfect. Jesus is the only one who's ever always been perfect. But have we constantly been striving for perfection? Have we been making progress in being more and more holy and pure in His sight? Are we striving always to please God and to do what He wants us to do? Jesus says, "If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." Are we always striving to uplift and uphold the commandments of God? And so that's kind of the devotional for us today. Just something kind of going back to an Old Testament account and reading this and gaining some application from this phrase. You've been weighed, you've been measured. How will we be found by Jesus at the last day? All right. Our next devotion will be on Tuesday, Lord willing. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.